be a good fit for them. Any kiddo. Good call. I totally forgot to remind you. So we are able to take any kiddos who just don't really do well in a traditional school setting. So I will hand it over to Pam.
Hi, everybody. I'm with the Attention Deficit Disorders Association. Put our information in the chat line, and we are offering free virtual support groups. And then we're proud to say we've got Dr. Russell Barkley coming November 13th. So check us out. We always advertise these wonderful ones, and then we have 3 additional support groups during the month. So it's good to be free sometimes.
Okay, I don't see Coach here. Okay, so. Well, I guess I'll go ahead and start. I'm Dr. Ron Swatzyna. I love doing these discussions. And it's something that we put a lot of work into. The fact that parents and educators and therapists all have challenging students, want to have to do the best for their students, for their kids. And this is what it's all about. So approach from a more neuroscience perspective. So let's see if I can get over and share the screen here. It's up here somewhere. And blow it up. Okay. Of course, I didn't have it queued up to the right place. Okay, as I was saying, I'm the Director and Chief Scientist of the Houston Neuroscience Brain Center. We're located on Kirby Drive, just north of 59. And Miss Alexandra works with me, and she's a therapist and a neurotherapist here. And she's been with me for 6 years plus, I think, going on 7. And it's been a wonderful journey. But we're going to talk today about the anxiety's impact of testing. Okay. There you go. All right, because we can't see. All right. So we're going to talk about anxiety's impact on testing. And anxiety is, it's not just one thing. It can be a lot of things. So we're going to get into that right now. We have in our bodies what we call an autonomic nervous system. And this is going to be a bit of brain science, but I'm not going to make it that complicated. There's a sympathetic branch of your autonomic nervous system and a parasympathetic branch. Now, the sympathetic branch on the right here, you see there's a lot of things that go on when you are preparing to fight or flee danger, okay? And in our brain, although school and work and testing and everything else, it's not a true danger. We're not having to avoid being eaten by some saber-toothed lion or something like that. We're just trying, when we start to test, and this happened so often to me when I was growing up, that we started the testing, and as soon as I hit the first question that stumped me, all of a sudden my brain went blank, and I just choked on so many questions because I just didn't have that information. Now, why did this happen? So as we go into a sympathetic nervous system response, this is to prepare us for fighting and running. So in these kind of cases, a lot of things changes in our body. The most notable thing that changes is that our heart rate increases and our vessels constrict. So that means our blood pressure goes up. Now our vessels constrict, bring in the blood away from the extremities into our body, into our core. And I think what through the millions of years of evolution, what had happened is that those creatures who had a better basal constriction to their extremities, they didn't bleed out when they were injured, when they were trying to fight or run. And so they survived. The rest were eliminated from the gene pool. So this is a part of the stress response, the sympathetic nervous system response. Our gut shuts down. It inhibits digestive activity. We start to breathe faster. We start to salivate. No, we stop salivating, and our pupils actually dilate. Now, why would they dilate? Well, you want to take in as much information as you can when you're trying to fight or when you're trying to run, because that's just how you survive. So that is the sympathetic nervous system. This is the people that will feel themselves, their heart starts racing, they start breaking out in the cold sweat. It does increase, stimulates the sweat glands so that you start to sweat to cool the muscles for fighting and running. Now, if you look at it like a seesaw, the sympathetic nervous system would be on and the parasympathetic nervous system would be off. The opposite then is true. Then when the parasympathetic goes on, the sympathetic nervous system turns off. And so in that, almost everything constricts. The pupils constrict, you start salivating, your digestive activity is still trying to, you ever pick up a frog and see what happens when you pick up a frog? Well, that's a sympathetic nervous system, that's a parasympathetic response because it starts to urinate. This is what happens. You know, it's this old adage when your mother tells you when you're going on a trip, make sure you have clean underwear on. Well, it's going to get dirty if you're really in trouble anyway. So this is part of the issue. This parasympathetic response is what we call a freeze response. And this freeze response takes you basically, in animals, they can actually, it's like rolling over and playing dead. They are actually, all their vessels have dilated, the blood drains from their head, and they're kind of in a state of just frozen animation. It's kind of interesting. But both of these responses can happen during testing, and neither one prepares you to take a test. Both of them affect your way of recalling information. In an actual fight or flight or freeze response, there's no reason for you to remember where you put your keys. You just need to make one decision: fight, run, or you're going to freeze. So this is the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system and how it works together. Next slide up there. Okay. So now let's break it down even further. You've got the gray matter on top, which is the cortical part of your brain, and then you got the subcortex underneath, the subcortical. Now the cortical part of your brain, this is, the subcortical part of your brain is the normal fight, flight, or freeze response. This is the survival. It's in every animal. Now, animals don't have a big cortex to say. Humans, that's what makes us rule over all the animal kingdom, is because we have this big cortex on top. So the subcortical part of your brain, the hippocampus, the nucleus accumbens, the amygdala, all of these work in conjunction together in order to prepare you to fight or run. So this is all subcortical. Now, we're looking at the cortical part of your brain. This is the part of the gray matter that's on top, and we have discovered over the past years that this can have anxiety that's not related at all to subcortical anxiety. And this is an existing type of anxiety that we see in about 20% of the population, and it's completely different. So we'll talk about interventions in just a minute. So we've got the fight, flight, or freeze response. The treatment, we look at HRV, heart rate variability biofeedback training. This is a type of biofeedback training which helps you to override that freeze response, basically put it to stop it. Because as you start breathing diaphragmatically, more slow at about 6 respirations per minute, it automatically tells the brain this is not a true fight or flight event happening right now. This is an event that this fight or flight is something that you will respond to, and it's almost automatic. So in this freeze response, fight, flight, or freeze response, we use the treatment of biofeedback relaxation training, basically, so you can learn to breathe yourself out of it. So you hear these people all the time when they start to get nervous, somebody will tell them, take a nice deep breath. So that's because on the lower part of your lungs, there's the sensors there that when you inflate the lungs slowly and deeply to that area, it disconnects that that fight, flight, or freeze response. So when you get trained fully in biofeedback training, it doesn't take you 10 minutes to relax. It can take 1 or 2 deep breaths to immediately pull yourself out. Now, for attorneys who are getting up there and doing closing arguments or something, they often prescribe propranolol, which is a medication which will inhibit the fight or freeze response. And so this drug basically keeps your steady heartbeat. It keeps your vessels dilated. It keeps everything in there so that they can have the brains that they need in order to deliver a good response. I know there's quite a few attorneys don't need the medication, but there's quite a few that do take the medication, and that's the reason why. So when we go into the cortical anxiety, we call this spindling excessive beta or fast alpha or both. We need to identify this on the EEG or the Q. Now, I'll tell you a story of how I came across this. I had one of my young guys, and he was very thoughtful young high schooler. He was a sophomore when I first met him. And he was having a lot of test anxiety. In fact, he couldn't finish his exams at the end of the semesters. Never has been able to finish an exam. But he was a very smart young man. So I thought, and we started with biofeedback relaxation training. And he became, in a month, became very good at doing this, at doing this relaxation type. But he still was not able to finish his test. So in his junior year, his mother came back to me and she said, Dr. Ron, she said, what else can we do? The biofeedback is not working. The tutoring's not helping him complete the test. Everything that we've tried hasn't worked. I said, well, the only thing I can think of, we got to take a look at his brain, see what's going on in his brain just to try to figure this out. So we did an EEG on him. We came back and he had this spindling excessive beta, this cortical-based anxiety. And I said, this is interesting. So we started doing neurofeedback with him. And we did 10, he had just taken, before we did the first EEG, he had just taken the ACT exam. And when he took the ACT exam, he made a 23. Well, the max is, what, 35 or 36? Something like that. That was quite not a very good score. And so we did 10 sessions, did the Q, did 10 sessions, and he came back. And without telling me, he went and tested again after only 10 sessions, which was about a month and a half. And he ended up making a 32 and got a full scholarship in the Wake. And he never had another problem finish another exam. So we addressed the issue. I don't think it's common to be able to do it in 10 sessions, to tell the truth. But this was an interesting response that we addressed the type of anxiety he had. And when we found out it wasn't subcortical, the cortical anxiety treatment of neurofeedback worked really well. Now, medication, for instance, depends on the speed of the alpha. If they've got a very fast alpha or spindling excessive beta, some of the norepinephrine needs to be removed. And that's what gabapentin, which is an anticonvulsant. It's not a very good anticonvulsant, but it works really well to remove some of this excess anxiety. And these would be the kids that are always thinking every little molehill becomes a mountain. They're very intelligent children, but they're just hobbled by their anxiety. Now, if it's just spindling excessive beta only, the Intuitive, which is, or other alpha-2 agonists, Intuitive is actually an old blood pressure medicine. And I was at the actual first presentation when they invited us to their nice restaurants. The doc's going to present on this new medication for ADHD in children that they had out, which is not a stimulant. And it was very interesting that this is an old blood pressure medication. So based upon my hypothesis, it looks like that the vessels in the brain constrict under a stress response. They dilate under a relaxation response. And the Tutum, being alpha-2 agonist old blood pressure medication, actually helps the vasodilation and helps this. And we've had very good results with that as well. We don't know who needs it until we do an EEG, but that's why I'm just trying to talk about that. And in these cases, stimulants, which people are often prescribed for anxiety and testing and intervention, they think it's a focus issue, they actually make it worse because it causes vasoconstriction instead of dilation. Okay, it's yours.
Okay. I'll roll up here. Okay. So what anxiety may look like at school. So it could look like inattention and restlessness. So from the outside, these kids may look like they have ADHD, but in reality, they're dealing with worries in their mind. So they could be paying attention, and then they have a worry, they have stress, they have anxiety, these thoughts that are clouding their mind, and then they'll start to fade away and not pay attention. And but this is triggered by anxiety. The next would be disruptive behavior. So the fight or flight response that Dr. Ron was talking about earlier, this disruptive behavior could look like the kids who are experiencing anxiety and they are going into their fight mode. So they're starting to feel like they're out of control from all these worries. And so they may start flipping the tables or taking it out on their teachers or their classmates whenever they feel upset or threatened. They may also have trouble answering questions in class. So these kids could be paying attention, and all of a sudden the teacher calls on them to answer a question. They could know that.
Okay, it's on in here. Come bring a chair.
And so they get called on, and then they just go blank. That it would be their freeze mode that he had mentioned earlier. So they could also ask to take a lot of frequent trips to the nurse or to the bathroom. And so this would be them experiencing their flight mode to their stress response. So whenever they're feeling anxious or worried, then they feel like if they can get away from the stressor, if they can go to the nurse, if they can go to the bathroom, then their bodies will be able to calm down. You could also see this at home when they're studying for their test or it's time for them to do homework. If they already have anxiety about studying for the test because they feel like they won't do well, or if they're feeling anxious about doing homework because they don't feel like they can do it, then they just feel like, okay, if I can avoid it, then I'm going to be okay. And then they won't feel as anxious if they were to do it. They may also shut down while taking the test. So this is when they would be in that parasympathetic mode, and the anxiety is just clouding their mind. So you have the prefrontal cortex, and then whenever they feel stressed, they see a question on the test that they don't know, then their prefrontal cortex locks up. They are then thinking from their amygdala, which is in charge of fear, and they're not able to access that critical thinking in the prefrontal cortex as they would if they were calm and they didn't have that anxiety. You may also see them have problems in certain subjects. Some certain subjects they just may have more struggle with, and so they have more anxiety going into that test. You may also see this in girls. They may be susceptible to the stereotype. You may be hearing that, girls aren't as good at math as boys, and so they may feel more anxiety leading up to a math test. You could also see second guessing and overly self-critical behaviors. Anxiety can lead to a lot of second guessing. So an anxious child may erase their answer over and over and over until they have a hole in their paper. They could be spending too much time answering a question because of the second guessing. And then they may also be dealing with perfectionism, which some people associate perfectionism with positive attributes, but really it could be a self-sabotage, or like the self-fulfilling prophecy, where if they feel like they aren't going to do well, then they're going to be more anxious going in, and then their prefrontal cortex is going to be locked up so they can't use their critical thinking, and then they do end up not doing as well as they could have. And so we also see that kids who have a lot of anxiety, especially around tests and homeworks, might be saying things like, I'm so stupid, I'm so dumb, and have those intrusive thoughts. So, oh, there we go. Okay. So how do we help these kids manage their anxiety? Well, first of all, we don't want to avoid the stressors. So avoiding the stressor might make the child feel better in the short term, but in the long term, that's really not that helpful, because it's just going to get them in the habit of running from it, and then it's going to reinforce that stressor. Also, you want to express positive and realistic expectations. You might not be able to promise them that they're not going to fail a test or that their fears are unrealistic. However, you want to express, the confidence that they're going to be okay and that you're here with them and that they're going to be able to get through it. You also want to respect their feelings, but you don't want to empower them. So it's good to know that validation doesn't always mean agreement. You want to listen to them and be empathetic and help them understand why they're anxious, but you want them to also know that they can face their fears. So the message would be like, I know you're scared and that's okay, but I'm here for you and you're going to get through this, and I'm going to be able to help you along the way and be here as your support system. You also don't want to ask any leading questions. So going into it, you don't want to say like, are you nervous about your test? Are you scared that you're going to fail? Instead, you would want to say, how are you feeling about your test? How is your body feeling as we're driving to school? Like, how are you feeling? You also want to make a plan. So just sometimes having a plan for if what they're worried about does happen, then they will have less anxiety going into it. So, if they're worried that they're going to fail a test, you could say, okay, well, if you do fail a test, then, is there a tutor we can get? Can we talk to the teacher? Is there a retest option? Is there extra credit? And having this backup plan, if their fear does come true, will help them go into it with less anxiety. And then lastly, you would want to model healthy anxiety for your kids. So this could look like practicing mindfulness. So just talking to them about how like our bodies feel when we're anxious. Like, like you could say, man, when I'm anxious, sometimes my hands get really sweaty, my heart's beating really fast, like I'll feel tension here, my stomach will get nauseous. And then having that like body awareness, like, how does your body feel when you're anxious? And then talking to them, well, when I feel anxious, it really helps me if I do my slow, deep belly breathing, and then practice doing breaths with them, engaging your diaphragm, expanding your rib cage, and doing the breaths really slow, and doing that with them. And also, you could try like the squeezing muscles technique, where like you start at your toes and you pick one muscle at a time and you squeeze it and you count to 5, and then you try to be mindful of like how your body is changing, and doing these things to model healthy anxiety. You could also talk to them about, like when I'm stressed, it can really help me if I, write out my feelings in my journal, and modeling these so they can know like, okay, these are healthy ways for me to manage my anxiety. There's also, as far as like the central nervous system, he was talking about when you're in your sympathetic and like your parasympathetic modes, it can actually be helpful if you take cold showers and practice your deep breathing there. Or some people find it really helpful to put an ice pack on their chest, and that just helps calm your body. And then doing the deep breathing along with that can be very helpful. So tips for studying and test taking. Dr. Kruger, he's a clinical psychologist at the Child Mind Institute, and he says that 90% of the students that he sees don't have an effective model of studying. He says what they end up doing most often is rely on the memory of what they heard in class or review their notes by reading them over. So he has some tips for studying and test taking. He says, know the test format. If it's multiple choice, if it's true or false, if it's fill in the blank, know that, and then try to study in that same format. You can also practice the deep breathing we've been talking about to clear the prefrontal cortex so that you can use your critical thinking instead of being engaged in your amygdala. And then he also says, accept when you don't know something. So sometimes the best way, like if you're taking a test and you see an answer and you just know that you don't know the answer, then just put something down and then move on and just accept it and focus on the next question. He also says, break the test up. So if there's a certain section that's starting to make you feel panicked, then sometimes just saying like, okay, I'm going to move on to another section that I know better, and then I can come back to this, and sometimes I can like shift your focus. He also says to have a plan. So if it's a multiple choice test, read each answer and then cross out the ones you know aren't right to help yourself narrow it down. Pick an answer and stick with it. It goes back to that second guessing I talked about earlier, and you can lead to wasting time. And then don't spend too much time on one question. And then if your child's fears are persistent or overly intense, becomes interfering with their life on a daily basis, then that might be the time to seek help and look at either getting an EEG, doing the HRV, or seeing a therapist to learn some healthy emotional regulation skills to deal with anxiety.
Okay. Like musical chairs here. Okay, now this is not, I'm sure that what we're talking about today is something that, let me remove this, is something that, stop share, that we've all experienced. I know my personal experience with test anxiety, I am not a good test taker, and I never have. And so I got through my master's with a 4.0 average, but because my bachelor's was a high enough GPA, I didn't have to take this GRE. So I decided I wanted to try to get this PhD, and I was really kind of apprehensive about it because, most of all, because I had to take the GRE for the actual get into my PhD program. Now, that didn't make a lot of sense to me, but the school didn't matter if it made sense or not. They wanted to see if I was smart enough to take graduate level studies. After making a 4.0 of my master's, did make sense. But finally, one of my professors, who was my biofeedback professor, he said, "Ron, just take the test." I said, okay. So here I am sitting outside this test center, anxious through the roof. And I didn't know what I was going to do. I tried studying for the math part, but being 30 years beyond my last math class was not good. And I did the best I could. And so I said, this is where I use my faith. I said, God, if you want me to go down this path, you may have to help me with some of these questions. And I think in doing that and letting go of that anxiety, so here I go and open up the test. Of course, the math is the first section. And the first question, I started with my pencil and paper and on my scrap paper and trying to write out this test, this question and everything else. One of these long, crazy questions that I hate, these written sentence questions for math. And 5 minutes into it, I had still not come up with the answer. And I said, there's no way I'm going to finish this test if I don't get going. Back to what Alexandra was just saying. So I said, okay, God, which one do you like, A, B, C, or D? And so I looked at it, what feels the right answer, and I put it in. I tell you guys, most of the math questions were done like that. But I tell you, of course, God wanted me to be here because it wasn't me that was answering those questions, it was him. So that's where I wanted to just bring this up, that you really, by letting that anxiety go, I've made a high enough score on the rest of the test, I guess, that it would allow me to do that. But sometimes you just got to do that. You got to give it your best guess and go on and let it go, because the anxiety will eat you up into stuff you already know. So that's mine. So I'd like to open it up now for questions from the group. Anybody have anything? Just raise your hand and unmute yourself and let's answer some questions. No questions. All anxious back
there. No questions came through over the chat, but maybe people are shy. If you don't want to speak, that's totally fine. You can put it in the chat.
What is your suggestion then, if you would? What do you try to tell your students?
It depends on the student. It kind of depends on what their needs are. You know, our teachers go through kind of fusion training, right? And so that's one of the things is like they help with students who have anxiety. And so I know that I kind of told the story before more people got on, but for us, we have the luxury of having one teacher to one student, right? And so since we do have the ability to kind of meet kids where they are, it really does help. So I gave the example earlier about our student who came in with severe test anxiety, very bright, but she just could not take a test. And so we were able to work with her and assess her, since we don't have to do state testing, we were able to assess her because she was really artistic. I'm like, okay, well, your biology class is coming up, one of your tests is coming up. We need to assess you, but you're really good at art. Let's start there. Let's start with what you're comfortable with. And then we were able to scaffold her learning and scaffold her testing and her assessments to where she felt more comfortable. and giving her different ways of doing that. One of the examples they do is, instead of one-to-one taking the test in the teacher's office, taking them out, putting them into a quiet cafe, or putting them into a different room where they're used to getting open, just little pieces, little steps to where we can actually connect and help kids feel more comfortable. Now, the first thing that I thought of whenever I heard this, the beginning of this story, was, okay, that's not going to work in a 300, student biology university hall. So how is this going to happen? But we were able to work with her, and a lot of these techniques that you mentioned is what we used. And so once we were able to have her test and take the SAT, she scored a 1530, right? It was just giving her the tools. We personally have a special education lead teacher who works with the teachers with different techniques, different ways to make kids more comfortable, because we do live in the world, we live out in the world. We can't just like always accommodate, but we can hopefully make kids more comfortable with this. So that's one of the things that we do. We just try different techniques and try to meet kids where they are.
Great. There is another question here. It says, can you tell me more about EEG testing? Okay. I've been doing EEGs with children since 2005 when I first started. And it's really interesting. Not all children are created equal, believe it or not. Their brains are different. Their learning challenges are different. And there's so much we can ascertain from a person's EEG that enables us to identify what's causing the learning issue. Is it in the left posterior temporal lobe where Wernicke's area is, where the learning area is? If it's in that area? And we have actually found, maybe we have a very skewed population, of course, because parents bring their kids to us for their learning issues and for their ADHDs mostly. But there's a lot of children that have this abnormal slowing in that part of the brain, meaning that part of the brain is firing slower than the other parts of the brain, and it disconnects it. Dyslexia, Erlen syndrome, and a lot of these different things are all focused around that area of the brain. And so when we find that, we're able to identify, well, number one, no matter what you do, you're not going to be able to medicate this, because medication speeds up the whole brain. It doesn't just go to one spot, speed that spot up, leave the rest of the brain alone. So you have side effects. And it still doesn't tie the brain together. So neurofeedback is where that makes it a fantastic option for that, because we can go and put the electrodes right there and train that brain, speed it up, bring it to the speed of the rest of the brain, and it ties itself back together. And children, it's really kind of remarkable. When children actually learn, or we retune these brains so they can actually get enjoyment out of reading, they like reading better than watching movies, because your imagination is much greater than what can be produced on a movie screen. So it's quite fascinating. And then with the anxiety, yes, the EEG allows us to see whether it's the spelling excessive beta anxiety or the very fast alpha anxiety. That and there's things we can do with that. So we have to look at each individual child as an individual, and each brain is an individual. And that's why we like doing the EEGs and the quantitative EEG brain mapping, because then we can compare that child to every other child at their age in the normative database and see where they differ. And then when it matches, we've got an approach we can use. So it's, I have students right now that I've seen in high school that come back in when they're in college and they want to do more work back in that area. And I say, why is that? They say, well, it really helps me not have to study so hard. So I said, really, you're just doing peak performance training? They say, yes. I said, okay, we can do that. We can make brains smarter and hold down the anxiety. That's not a problem. We do peak performance training with executives, with attorneys, with everybody else, trying to give them an edge over their competition at the same time, maintaining the anxiety within an acceptable level. So the astronauts at NASA have used neurofeedback training for years. So there's no reason why we can't optimize the functioning of every child's brain, regardless. And that's why we do the brain camps in the summertime, 2 sessions a day, back to back, for 10 days, and allows them to do 20 sessions in 2 weeks. Makes a big difference in the learning ability of these children. So all ways in which we can try to intervene. We have any other questions out there? I hope that answered it. Andrew, you got any anything from Linda Move Bell, how you guys approach it?
It's kind of interesting as you're speaking about this. There's some certain students that just pop in my brain. And actually, I think I was just talking to you about this student where we've helped them with their reading. You know, they were at a 3rd grade reading level, brought them up to grade level at 7th grade. And for some reason, when you put a test in front of them, they just start guessing at everything. They're not actually reading it and going through the problems. And I have to assume that it is an anxiety response. And we just figured out, oh, if we start reading the questions to him, he slows down and actually answers instead of just guessing everything. So, but that's some interesting tools or prompts that we can do to help slow those students down, maybe in advance of the evaluation, like you all were saying, asking them how they're feeling, making sure they have those study skills and breathing methods in place, and all of that will be really good.
Well, I think your point about reading it to them is a very valid point. We have a receptive and expressive language. We got auditory learners and we got visual learners. And depending on which part of that Wernicke's area that's affected, you could have better ability to listen than you can to see or read it and translate that into whatever is being said. So I think that's something that probably that all of you guys should do is find out, number one, is there a difference in their visual learning versus their auditory learning? And if there is, there's an indication that there's something going on with that part of the brain, and that we could take a look at, because you should be able to equally learn auditorily and visually. And if you're very strong in one and not very good at the other, that's another indication we might want to do an EEG and see what's going on. But that's a good point. But I like the option of reading it to them, because like you say, they weren't getting it by reading it themselves, obviously. Makes a big difference. I know when I'm taking notes in class, when I was in class, I couldn't take notes and listen at the same time. Just no way. I had a lot of concussions playing high school football, and I wasn't a very good student, and I flunked out of Memphis State my first year and went to Vietnam because they pulled my draft department away. So I've experienced all the heartfelt, I can't do it, I'm so dumb type of experiences as I was growing up. And I'm going to find out later that I actually did have the intelligence. I had limited access because I had most of my head injuries, my concussions I had were in this area, and it still looks atypical in my left posterior temporal. But my brain's wired around it by now, and I love doing what I do. So it's working now, but it took a lot of years to get to that point. So, any other questions out there from anybody?
Yes, we have a question. What is neurofeedback training?
Okay, well, who's this from? Tracy. Hi, Tracy. Neurofeedback training. Let me get my expert here.
So basically, neurofeedback training, it's switching chairs again. So how it works here is we have a select protocol for you based off of the EEG. The EEG will show us what parts of the brain we need to train and what frequency that we need to train it to. And so they come in, they're watching a movie. We have like Netflix or Disney Plus, and something to motivate them to keep them engaged. And then whenever their brain, we have this cap. And so depending on what part of brain we're training, we'll put some gel in there and we'll have a wire connected to it. It's all non-invasive and it's painless. And then the wire is connected to an amplifier, which is connected to the software. And so it's reading the electrical activity of that part of the brain. And then, so it's seeing what frequency it's performing at. And so whenever it's performing at the frequency we want it to, that's their protocol, the screen is bright and the sound is on. And then whenever their brain isn't matching the protocol, the screen dims and the sound dims. And so their brain, it's all kind of happening subliminally, like you're not really controlling it, but your brain is. You're just watching the show, but your brain over time, it's start to pick up, oh, when I perform this way, the screen is bright and the sound is on. So I want to keep watching my show. I want it to be bright. So I want to keep performing that way. So you do have to do it at least 2 times a week. For the minimum time we have is 35 minutes per session of like watching. And then we control it. So like we look at your score, and if you're scoring really well, then we might make it a little harder. And if you're scoring a little low, we'll make it easier for you. But yeah, so your brain just picks up that frequency over time, and we're building stronger connections. So it performs the way we want it to at its most optimal state. And it sticks. There's research studies that show that with enough sessions, then it's permanent. And yeah, your brain will just keep performing that way.
Now, what they found with doing this testing pre and post, the 10-year follow-up studies show that this information, these changes that we make, it's like operant conditioning. We think about riding a bicycle or playing the piano. Once you have that ability, those pathways are there, you'll always have the ability. It's just you may have to have a little bit of refreshing of the skills. But they found that in doing pre and post IQ testing, that the IQ scores were increased by 12 to 23 points, which is a phenomenal amount of increase. But I don't think it's actually increase in IQ. I think it's increase in your ability to test. And so I think that's where the big difference is. So if anybody wants to do this, they have the old IQ scores, and we can do the neurofeedback. I'd sure like to reproduce this more and more times to see what kind of gains we're getting, because access to IQ is everything. I think there's really, the IQ testing is limited in its ability to really produce how smart a person is, because of the person's ability to test, not their knowledge, not their intelligence. All right, anything else out there? I think we're good. Let me see.
I was just going to make a comment, Ron. My son has a fairly severe anxiety disorder along with the ADHD. And I do think it's been really interesting through the years to see him learn to process it and take care of it on his own. Now he's been on medication, but he's very open about it. So, he'll know, for instance, if he's got to go, like when he used to go to a support group meeting, he knows to take his meds then. So his is more of a situational thing, or like driving or some of those types of things. But I know he's found some of the breathing techniques and the things that Alexandra mentioned very helpful. But he was diagnosed very early on. But I also think it took a while for them to figure that out. So much of it looked like the ADHD. So since he was very hyperactive and was diagnosed at age, I think it took a while for the anxiety, knowledge to kick in a little bit. But I think that's what's hard a lot of times when we're talking to people about ADHD is there's, 2 or 3 of them, you read them and they all sound an awful lot alike. And so I think it's just been an interesting journey for us, is that just trying to figure out what's this and what's that. But anyway, I have been impressed, because I think it's probably a very, tough situation. We all feel anxiety, but not to that point where it can almost be crippling. So I applaud people that are learning to cope with it, because a lot of times I just think it goes either undiagnosed, or people just go, oh, well, it's just, whatever, or get over it, or whatever that they think's going to solve it. But I think a lot of it was just that we, just sort of worked around it and knew that was his personality. So it wasn't a huge deal. And there were certain things that we didn't, maybe go to or do because of it. But I know, like Stephanie and Andrew were saying, I think a lot of it is having a person right there with them that understands, because he was not going to go on his 6th grade graduation trip to San Antonio. He went to a small private school, but there were a couple adults that he knew very well. So he went and had the time of his life. So I think that's been our thing, is to get them connected with somebody that makes them feel comfortable. And then they're more willing to try the new things as they get older.
And you just triggered something in me, and I probably should have mentioned it. ADHD, learning issues, the brain's functioning optimally. We have to go back to the basics. If they stay up all night long studying for a test, they're going to bomb the test. You've got to have sleep in order to inset memories. So pulling an all-nighter to study for an exam of any sort is not smart. Number two, I see so many kids go to school and they won't eat breakfast because they're taking their stimulants or whatever. Hypoglycemia, lack of blood sugar, is also a major increase. It has a major increase in anxiety, and that can be measured. So you want to, I always recommend if they can take cheese, the individually wrapped cheese are one of the fastest foods in that won't cause a blood sugar swing, but they really will give you the energy to complete a test. So that's something that everybody needs to know. Make sure you preload with some protein before you go into the test, and it's going to make all the difference in the world. Also, avoid high sugar, high carb intake. When you eat breakfast, eat Eggos, eat chocolate milk and all this other kind of stuff. Well, in about an hour and a half, that your blood sugar is going to soar, and your pancreas is going to kick in all of your insulin and completely wipe you out, make you go hyperglycemic, hypoglycemic in the test, and you won't be able to retrieve anything. So exercise is the last component that's very vital to allowing you to get the toxins, respiration, perspiration, to get the toxins out of your brain, so you clear up the clutter so that you don't have it's kind of like having a desktop on your computer with everything all over the front. You can't make sense of anything. So those back to basics are always important. If your parents out there and you got kids in school, and I saw this one mother that had chimed in that talks about having 2 children. Look at those things. Look at their sleep the night before. Make sure they get a good protein breakfast and see what kind of difference it makes. And if your children get home in the afternoon and all of a sudden you're just having all these behavioral issues with your kids, on the way home, you should have them some protein to eat, and you'll knock out a lot of the anxiety, a lot of the arguments, a lot of everything, because by that time they're hypoglycemic. And when you're out of blood sugar, it's time to fight. So it's one of these things that I think we always got to look at is how are we treating this brain? This brain is the most important organ you have. It's, for 4 pounds, it is extremely needy and has a very fine balance between sleep, exercise, and nutrition. And we have to make sure that we feed it properly and take care of it properly, because that's what's going to make you living. These kids not eating breakfast and trying to go to school all day, and they skip lunch a lot of times, they're low on blood sugar. And that's not the way the brain is meant to perform. All right, guys? Stephanie, you want to close this out?
Yes, sir. Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate you being here. I will go ahead and keep an eye out for the recording. Alexandria typically sends it to me within a couple of days. And then, perfect. And then I will go ahead and send everybody who registered the recording. And then, of course, all the information that you might need to get in contact with Dr. Ron. So we have our next event. Okay, I do not have it pulled up. Hold on.
November 16th.
I do have it. The 10th.
Nope.
Nope.
I think, did I put the wrong date on there?
No, it's the 17th.
Yeah, the 17th.
Okay.
Fear of failure to launch. And so we'll, I have not put that on the website yet, but I will put that on the website before I send everybody the registration. That way you can just go in and it's easy to click on there. So I have a couple other events though. Please go ahead and get on the Fusion events site, and then you'll be able to see all of the future events. I'll go ahead and keep putting those up there. So look forward to seeing everybody next month.
And in that presentation, this is not just for parents that have older children. This is for parents, and like I tell the kids all the time when they come in to see me, your parents are bringing in not for what's going on now, but for what they're worried about when it comes time for you to leave home. And that we're going to get into specific ways and I've got graphs and everything out, lay out how we should be allowing our children to mature and age, so that they start taking over responsibilities for themselves in an incremental basis, so that they're ready to go off to college and to self-regulate. And that's what this is all about. So it'd be for parents of all age children. this will be a good presentation.
That's wonderful.
All right,
Thank you,
well,
Dr. Ron.
thanks again for everybody, and I really appreciate you guys attending these. And you have any questions, you can always email us over here at, do we still have our thing on? Go ahead and share. You put our contact information in, didn't you? There it is. You guys want to write that down? I'll leave it up for a while. And I appreciate you attending, and just let me know any way we can help. If you got any questions, just email me. All right.
Good. Thank you.
You're very welcome. You guys have a good afternoon. We'll talk to you next month.
Yes, sir.
All right. And I guess we'll end. Bye, guys.